did my time. I paid for my crime.
I want to say a big good evening going out to everybody across the globe.
Already did my time.
Saturday night at 6 o'clock. It's time for another edition of Issues Today on World Jam Global Radio.
Already did my time. I paid for my crime.
Special guest this evening, including former Chief of Police Jerry Summers, and our very special guest,
In my time. I paid for
Nancy West, survivor of OIDV, officer involved domestic violence. To you.
I didn't really care about the system. It was all about survival. It was do or die. I had too many.
In a week when we've seen terrorism raise its ugly head again,
I learned my lessons in the street.
13 killed and over 80 injured as a lunatic drove through a crowded streets in Spain.
Women, I had girls all
7 stabbed in Russia by a man wearing a fake
the whole game is
suicide bomb belt
man.
or vest.
Hand. It ain't about being no
Another attack gone out in Finland,
all in jail. Trying to cope.
all spelling worry and concern as we look around the world and wondering where next.
Already.
As me and my wife discussed this earlier on, she said that these people are only trying to hurt our economy because what they're doing is they're targeting and attacking hot tourist attractions
Already did my time. I paid for my crime.
with no specific target in place. Makes sense a little.
I was a drug dealer, sold more drugs than Superfly, but I never got high on my own.
Also noticed this week that Donald Trump's cabinet continues to fall apart, with Mr. Bannon being the latest to fall offside, or go overboard, so to speak.
I'll sit back and think it over since I've gotten older. The life I used to live, I
I
wouldn't
suppose we're all just wondering how much longer it will be before Mr. Trump goes overboard himself, huh?
go, but I was nobody's chump. Me and Billy the Kid had
As for me, this will be my last show for at least 2 to 3 weeks, as me and the family go away on a well-deserved annual leave.
a real
Off to St. Lucia.
all you had.
I'd celebrate my father's 80th birthday.
Statements are going on right now. He could be facing life in prison.
Very excited about the prospect, I must say.
Already did my time. Paid for my crime.
But coming back to today's show, we've never actually crossed this bridge. This is very unfamiliar territory to us, but I believe it's a very important and significant issue that we at Issues Today must take on and challenge.
My crime, baby, my crime.
My wife worked in domestic violence for some time,
Already did my
so we are fully aware of the impact that it has.
Already did my time. I paid for my crime. I'm trying to get this felony
And I remember doing a show on domestic violence many years ago when I was on Radio
citizen again.
Plus in Coventry.
All of my friends in the pen.
And we actually identified the fact that Coventry actually had one of the highest rates of domestic violence that also took place, funny enough,
And women
every time England lost a football match.
getting money. Life is so sweet. Now things have changed.
Thugs came home and took it out on their wives.
I'm a changed man. Don't need no gun in my hand.
Been trying to search for some officer-involved domestic violence statistics for the UK. We don't seem to have much,
Trying to cope with
but I'm quite sure as the show unravels,
did my time. I paid for my
we'll
crime.
get to find out just how deep and sensitive this situation really is.
I paid for my crime.
We had Jerry Summers on the show just a short while ago
I paid for my crime.
on a program entitled Tarnishing the Badge,
Already did my time. I paid for my crime.
the title of the book that is recently authored and released.
I paid for my crime.
Really look forward to hearing his input and contribution to a very sensitive subject indeed.
Drugs and Superfly, but I never got how
But
much
most importantly, very shortly coming up, we're going to have Nancy West, a survivor
when you.
of officer-involved domestic violence.
I was doing
And she has not just a story of her own to tell,
now. Sit back.
but as an advocate
I've gotten older.
and a spokesperson for many others in the OIDV community.
I was a real force.
Quite sure she'll have some case studies for us to look over as well.
Me and Billy the Kid had a lot
In the meantime, you've got just about enough time to put the kettle on, get the coffee together,
of Schwarzenegger. I'd shoot you up with
get yourself in front of the set,
alligator.
get plugged in and ready. It's time for another show of Issues Today on World Jam Global Radio.
Already did my time. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time.
The opening statements are going on right now. He could be facing life in prison.
You will be able to join me tomorrow morning for another Wake Up Everybody Sunday Gospel Show. That's why I do Church Before Church. Got some live interviews coming across from South Carolina. The Jones Boys, David Jones in particular, from the Jones Boys of North Carolina. Massive gospel group out there with a brand new single.
Trying to cope with this living here.
And also Sandra Dawn from the Angel Dove Music Productions of Marlon McNichols.
Already did.
Don't forget to clock in on that. That's 8 o'clock tomorrow morning UK time.
Our Father who art
GMT.
hallowed be thy name
Don't forget you can also catch me in Cardiff on the 8th of October,
on earth as it is in
where I
heaven.
go home after over 24 years of being away
Daily bread.
for the anniversary of Radio Cardiff, the radio station I set up many years ago in 1993.
And lead us not into
Been awarded the #1 community radio show in a radio station in the UK.
power, the glory forever and
I'd
ever.
like to say that's my legacy. Hopefully I can do a bit more in what I'm doing today, raising awareness across the globe. But without no further ado, I'm going to take you across to our first guest and introduce you to Jerry Summers, who's waiting on the line. Jerry. Hello, Jerry.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. What an honor to be back again, Kervin.
Absolutely. If you just can give an audience just a quick summary of who you are, what you used to do, what you do now, and let them know a little bit about you before we introduce our main speaker for tonight.
Love to. I am a retired chief of police. I was forced into retirement for holding a high government official accountable to the laws that every citizen has to follow. I was terminated, wound up in a federal lawsuit that I prevailed on 2 counts of retaliation. As a result of that, that ruined my law enforcement career, and I went into becoming an author. I've published 4 books. The 5th will be out this fall. The nonfiction book, Tarnishing of the Badge, was written to explain what is going on and why law enforcement is losing the public's trust and what they need to do to change and correct it in order to earn that trust back, or we're going to wind up finding ourselves in chaos and anarchy. And I think the world events are kind of showing that is developing, especially with last night with 6 officers in the United States killed within a couple of hours, or shot within a couple of hours. 2 in Jacksonville, 2 in Pennsylvania, and 2 in Kissimmee, Florida. So we're having problems. And my background, I spent 16 years in law enforcement. I've handled stuff from patrol to investigations to school resource officer. I was the head of the investigations division. I also did the internal affairs investigation and ultimately wound up as a chief of police for 8 years prior to my termination.
Wow, that's some resume. And I remember when we last spoke, when we had you on the show on Tarnishing the Badge, you were just launching your website for the work that you were doing. How's that going?
It's going great. I've got a website that I'm the founder of, letsmakeitmatter.com, and that's tied into both Conflict Resolutions, which is a company I own for speaking and training engagements, as well as Jerry Summers Author. Predominantly what I'm doing at Let's Make It Matter is I'm working and with people that have been wrongfully convicted. I'm reviewing their cases, the investigation help thing, and working towards getting them an appeal.
I remember after we did the last show, we had some rave reviews and some great comments, and people were really impressed at the reforms that you were suggesting on that particular show, what needed to be done, and how strongly you stood for that. So that's just to be commended, and I thank you once again for being able to join us again on this show, which I felt compelled to invite you to come and support. Once I'd spoken with our guest that I'm about to introduce now, Nancy West, survivor of officer-involved domestic violence. Good evening, good afternoon, Nancy.
Good evening, Kervin, and good morning in America or in California. And hello, Jerry. Thank you so much Thank you so much for this opportunity to spread OADV awareness.
If you'd like to tell the audience just a little bit about yourself, who you are, how long you were married to an officer, and etc., what sort of lifestyle that you've led, without going into the details, so that we can use that as the foundation for launching into the questions and the interview that will have to do with you.
Sure, thank you. Well, my name is Nancy West, and I am an awareness advocate and OADV survivor. We weren't married, and our relationship really didn't last very long. We were together about 3 years, and we did have a child together. My life completely fell apart after we separated, and I didn't understand why. So it's been 20 years, and it's been 20 years that I've been going through the officer involved domestic, I guess you could say, stalking or harassment, but it took a long time to learn why this was happening to me, and it made me, as I spoke to other survivors, I learned that I needed to do something. I'm really lucky to be alive after what I've learned from so many others, and therefore it's my obligation to help spread awareness and help do what I can for other lives.
Nancy, do you want to start off just by telling us a little bit about what your relationship was like? I mean, let's start. Let's go back to the beginning, shall we? Because this particular title of this show is "Married to the Badge." So, at some point before you got married, you must have been attracted to, in love with, being romanced by the person that was to eventually abuse you.
Yes, I was. I think if I may, I'd like to first explain that officer-involved domestic violence happens at 2 to 4 times the national rate, and only 49% of the victims live through their escape plans. Many of the cases are ruled suicide, and we don't hear about it much because, well, they're silenced. And I think Jerry could probably explain all about the art of silencing. I'm assuming he could help me out with that. But they're very, very professionally silenced, and many of these survivors just find themselves alone in the world. They didn't know what they were getting into. They thought they were with someone who could protect them and love them. So anyhow, now you asked me, what was the question again?
Well, tell us a little bit about this, the relationship, because the person that you married, at some point, you must have romanced you, dated you, you must have been in love with, attracted to, before the abuse started. So tell us a little bit about how you how you got involved with the man that you eventually married, who was an officer. How did you get married to the badge?
Well, I think that like so many other ladies, they're attracted to someone they feel that can protect them. It's kind of a scary world these days, and we all feel a little unsafe at times. And the old idea of a relationship anyway is for two people to come together and look out for each other, right? And so when you have a man with a badge, uniform, he seems powerful and protective, because that's what his role is.
So I suppose the point I'm making is, when you met him, did he already have the badge?
Right, yes.
Okay.
Yes, he did.
So you met him with the badge. He was a serving officer, and was the badge his uniform? And I don't mean this in a corny way, but was his badge, his uniform, also an attraction for you? Did that give you a sense of security, that he was marrying a good man, and by the fact that he had a badge and a uniform, that increased his level of integrity in your eyes? Was that, you know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. We're taught as children that the police are there to protect us and look out for us, and they're just all around good, right? So you think you kind of assume that that's what you're getting when you start a relationship with someone.
So then give us an idea of how we went about sweeping you off your feet.
Uh, well, it's nothing really exciting. I mean, it was my birthday, and and we were kind of some girlfriends took me out for the evening, and we got back and we were playing music, and we were a little too loud, and someone called the police on us. And so he came out, and it was really uneventful. We promised to be quiet, but he came back the next day and said he was checking on me to see how I was. And one thing led to another, and we ended up starting seeing each other. So it wasn't really anything very exciting, but that's how it went.
Mm-hmm.
But as time went on, like I said, we weren't together very long. As time went on, I was already going through some difficult times, so I kind of think that he saw that as an opportunity to control me. So the jealousy started rearing its head, and I found myself not allowed to speak to friends and not have not even my own family members without permission. I was becoming isolated, and there were always excuses, and my car was fixed so I couldn't drive it. I went somewhere, and I actually went for a walk because I couldn't drive my car, to buy the ingredients to make his favorite meal. But I saw one of his friends at the store, and he was home before I got home. This was during his work hours, so he had taken off work. And when I got home, he gave me the third degree. Where were you? You were cheating on me. And I found out later that he had been talking to neighbors and friends and really doing all kinds of things to discredit me and make people not like me and think the worst of me.
So how long into the relationship was you finding this out?
How long into the relationship was I having bad experiences?
Yeah, how long into the relationship was you having these sort of experiences? Did his behavior start to manifest?
Well, first it was just little jealousy behaviors, things that I guess people would just think he's being human. He's just, but
I suppose what I'm trying to say is, and please be aware that I'm not trying to trip you up or trick you in any way. Did any of that alarm you? Was it? Because let me just put it this way: there are some behaviours that we think that might be a bit strange, might be a bit weird, but they don't alarm us as yet. We're not really seeing the smoke signals yet, and sometimes we just think, well, it's a bit strange, but taking everything else into consideration, I think in a minute I can handle that. So that what I'm trying to get at is, how soon into the relationship did the strange behaviour start, and how dismissive of it was you at first before it escalated? I suppose that's where we're trying to go.
Right. I guess I try to shy away from that part of the conversation simply because I don't want to be taken as someone who, is, my focus is OIDV and not am I someone who should have known better kind of a thing.
No. Let me say this. The reason I say this is because there are people who are listening. There are people that will listen. And it's a long running problem that we've had in our world, not just where you are with officers, but in relationships worldwide, where women get involved in a relationship, strange behavior starts, they dismiss it for a long time, and before they know it, they're caught up in something that they just cannot get out of. So I suppose I'm just trying to get some sort of a window of how this thing took place before it started to get alarming, and then you couldn't get out. So please,
right.
That's what I'm trying to get at.
As I look back, there were many red flags in the beginning that I dismissed. So that's something that I, wish I hadn't done. Of course, I think we all do that though. So, I don't want to punish myself too much, but we were only together for about 3 years. We did have a child together, and we separated when she was 6 weeks old. But the things that were not dismissible were when I was 4 months pregnant, and he wanted to force me into an abortion because he didn't want a girl, and that was really a traumatic situation. In fact, it's
So was that more emotional and mental abuse than physical at that time?
Now I'm one of the lucky ones, and again, because I'm lucky enough to be alive, I speak out for others. My daughter, when I was 4 months pregnant, and he tried to force me into the car to go get an abortion. Now he had made comments. I want to kill both of you. Things like that. It was fairly early in our relationship. The first time he threatened me with his gun, I got all the apologies and the flowers and all of these things. I was drinking excuses, which a lot of people, those tactics, when you fall in love with someone, you really want to believe they're sorry. Yeah. So this is the kind of thing that happens, and if you don't know better, you're going to fall for it. And so that's why so many people take too long to get out of a bad situation like that. But when he tried to force me into the car, I managed to get the keys and get away from him. I got in the car and locked the doors, and he called the police on me. And they were there before I could get out of the driveway. So during that time, they told me that he explained that I had beat up on him and been abusive to him. And so I explained to them what actually happened, and they said, well, if you want to press charges against him, you're going to go to jail too. And I said, well, I didn't call you, and I don't want anyone going to jail. I just want to be safe. So I asked them to take me somewhere. Could they take me to a shelter or something? And they said no, they couldn't do that, which is I thought that the laws had changed or something, because they said they couldn't take me to a shelter. But what the fact is that OIDV survivors, victims, don't get taken to shelters typically.
Is that because the police protect the police as opposed to trying to defend a victim?
Well, there are a couple reasons. The shelters typically don't accept police domestic violence victims because the police know where they are. And shelters, some of the...
they're meant to be anonymous and obscure.
Very, very, very dangerous. And so in the police, we again, only 49% of the victims survive through their escape plans. So the shelters know all.
Let's just try and bring Jerry in here for a minute. Jerry, I'm not sure how much experience that you've had in either dealing with officer-involved domestic violence, but can you hear her plight, and do you have an understanding of what she's trying to put across to us at the moment?
Absolutely. First of all, I just want to kind of put a disclaimer out there that domestic violence happens across the board in all professions. She is absolutely right that it's 2 to 4 times higher in the field of law enforcement than it is in any other profession, perhaps with the exception of maybe surgeons. Surgeons are known because, and high stress jobs relate that. That does not excuse it at all. The problem for victims of officer-involved domestic violence is exactly what Nancy is describing. One, shelters don't take them because the officers are aware of where it is. Officers tend not to cooperate or help the victim because they're dealing with that thin blue line mentality. And the problem is in domestic violence, as most people know, that it is a cycle, and that cycle starts out with what Nancy was describing as isolation, and then it goes to attacking the person's individual self-worth through verbal abuse. Then we get isolation, physical and financial isolation, friendship isolation from family and friendship. Then you see the abuse, then you see the control. And we know that domestic violence, like rape, is about power and control, not necessarily else. The other thing I want to say is that whenever a woman or a victim leaves a domestic violence relationship, the first 6 months is the most critical for them, because 75% of all domestic violence homicides occur within the first 6 months. Now, add to that the problem that the officers know where all the shelters are, and there's very few places that a victim of officer-involved domestic violence can go to. The other problem is if they find a friend that they can go to, the officer has the ability to determine where they are much easier than an average citizen, and then the harassment starts. Other people show up, they start driving by, they stay outside the house, they start stopping the friends for minor traffic violations, and it can just be overwhelming. So what it's basically done is that effort is done in an attempt to not allow the victim to leave. So yes, that happens very much so. Now, the other problem that we look at is, and this ties back to a lot of things with the lack of transparency, is that when an officer becomes certified, in order to go through a post academy or a training academy, they have to meet certain requirements, and those requirements involve lack of violence, no domestic violence, no felony charges, obviously. And if there is a felony domestic violence charge that has been levied against that individual, they have to be adjudicated and through that for a minimum of 5 to 10 years, depending on the state that they're looking at, before they'll be able to petition a waiver to get into law enforcement. The problem is that's going into, and same thing with a misdemeanor domestic violence. If it's a misdemeanor, then it's a shorter period of time. It's either 5 to 3 years, depending on the state you're going in. The problem is that eliminates you. It doesn't allow you to become certified. But once you're certified, if there's a charge of domestic violence against you, and you're convicted, or most of the time they plead to a lesser charge, they get away from the domestic violence charge and plead to disturbing the peace or something like that, if it's a misdemeanor, and a battery if it's felony. Do that in an effort, because let me back up. If you're convicted of that after an officer, there's only about 19% of those officers that lose their jobs for being convicted of something that would have kept them out of even being certified. So what we're looking at is the inability for some administrators to automatically terminate because of a domestic violence plea bargain or something like that. And my position is, if a charge would keep you from being certified, once you're certified, if you're given that same charge, there should be an automatic suspension or termination of your certification. End of story.
Okay, so
Thank
that clarifies that to a great deal, and again, that's if you've got an officer or chief of police like Jerry Summers on board. Did you ever try to report what was taking place at home to his superiors, his sergeant, his chief, Nancy?
No. What I did was, well, yes, I called his department. I never called. Now, I live in the city of Anaheim, and he worked for, is this okay to say the cities?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, he worked for the city of Santa Ana. And I never reported him to the police, as in to call Anaheim Police Department. But when things got to be so impossible for me, I called his department, speak to someone, see if somebody would be willing to help me out, talk to him, do something for me. But what I got was, and I'd like to share this list of problems that the survivors run into. Now, these were my experiences, but also these are experiences that I learned through my studying and through my personal work with other OIDV survivors. So we all experienced this same set of circumstances when we're trying to get help, and that's why so many people end up dead because they go through this without getting any help. So my list is things that the abuser says to them when they ask them to stop. They're going to try, if they're going to report them and so forth. They say, "Who are you going to call?" "One of my buddies." "I am the police." They say, "No one will believe you over an officer of the law." "I'm going to kill you and I'll get away with it because I'm a cop." They falsely document suicidal tendencies about the victim, which I will explain to you. That's part of my the abortion story. But about my experience, and they promulgate and file false. They create false files against the victim. So but then when you try and call the police departments for help, you hear you're a troublemaker. You're just trying to get him fired. We have a file on you. If anyone gets arrested, it's going to be you. They just don't show up, or they don't take a report, or they take a false report. And when they do, and now I'm not saying every single case, okay? Like I said, I got really lucky in the end, and there were charges filed against mine, but I still had to go through a lot of this first. Evidence such as injury photos are often omitted from the reports. So they take the pictures apparently, but they don't make it into the report. Domestic violence charges and jail time often happen to the victim. And then there's denial of shelter and any services whatsoever for many unlucky OIDV victims.
You've raised quite a few questions there in itself. I just want to go back to Jerry for 1 minute. Jerry, is there no way, because this is very similar to all the other, and I mean, I don't want to group anything because everything has its own position, right? Whether it be unlawful killing, police brutality, domestic violence, I don't want to be bunching stuff up. But is it not the same sort of thing that police just think that they're above the law in every respect, and no matter what the situation is, sometimes officers just feel that they can actually, literally, get away with murder?
The short answer to that is yes. It's not in all situations, but here's where the lack of transparency that I was talking about the last time I was on your show really comes into effect. Let me give you some statistics. The reality of a police officer being charged with the crime of domestic violence is very slim. In 1988 to 99, Boston Police Department had 23 domestic violence complaints that were filed against their employee. Not one of them resulted in a criminal prosecution. San Diego city attorney typically prosecutes 92% of all domestic violence cases that are referred to them, but only 42% of those cases are prosecuted when they involve a police officer as a perpetrator. In 1990 to 1997, the Los Angeles Police Department investigated 227 alleged domestic violence claims against their officers, of which 91 of those were sustained. In other words, the LA Police Department found that there was validity and there was domestic violence that occurred. Of the 91 sustained allegations by the department, only 4 resulted in a criminal conviction. That means that Los Angeles Police Department itself determined 91% of the cases that the officer had committed domestic violence, but only 4 were convicted of criminal charges. And of that, only 1 of those 4 were terminated. The other 3 got 15 days off without pay. And that was the extent of the crime. Yet as a male, or if I were to be involved in domestic violence as a non-police officer, those statistics wouldn't even come close to the standing place. So the problem is that not only do they know that their buddies can and may protect them depending on the culture of the department they work for, but they also know that there's a lack of transparency because we can't get to disciplinary records of police departments. So not only can the administrators, and I'm not saying it's always a chief, it could be a sergeant, it could be a lieutenant, it could be a captain somewhere up in the line, can stop the whole process and bury it within a personnel matter. The other option that comes out is that they, as Nancy say, they further victimize the victim by saying she's one crazy, she's suicidal, she's just trying to get the officer, they're having a relationship, she's trying to use the officer's position to get him fired. There's all that sensitivity and all those things to be done, and that's just a way of burying it. And the officer knows that that's going to happen. It's further power and control over the victim. So, if once again we open up the personnel records of every agency, then the heads of those agencies can no longer hide that. Did I lose you?
No. We lost signal for just a very brief second, but you were okay. I mean, here in the UK, forces across England and Wales received over 436 allegations of abuse of power for sexual gain against 306 police officers, 20 police community support officers, and 8 staff in the 2 years up until March. But inspectors believe that the problems are more prevalent than the numbers suggest. Now, if that's here in the UK, and we have police complaints authority, we have the ombudsman, we have all different types of independent bodies that are not associated or attached to the police force. How much more difficult is it going to be for somebody who's married to the badge to be able to lodge a complaint against an officer where the system where that officer works in is geared towards defending the integrity of the badge as opposed to the integrity of what the badge is meant to serve?
It's extremely difficult, and it's the victim in an officer-involved domestic violence situation feels helpless because the officer has control over much of the investigation, and they use that. They use that to the effect of, you can go ahead and call, but you're going to talk to my buddies, and they're going to protect me, and all I have to do is tell them you're suicidal and crazy, and they're going to believe me over you, and that further makes that victim feel helpless, and so some of them stay in this situation, and some of them are brave enough to break away from that, and it takes an enormous amount of integrity and a very strong culture of integrity within a police department to go ahead and hold one of their own accountable for domestic violence. The administrator, from an administrator standpoint, I can tell you when I investigated officer-involved domestic violence situations, I was attacked from within the organization. What are you doing? Why are you taking their word over them, the victim's word over it? And my point is, if an officer is involved in domestic violence, they have no business being an officer, and that it's as simple as that. If you can't control your way of handling disagreements within your own personal relationship, you certainly can't hold it with other relationships. And abusers who are abusers, whether they're officers or any other profession, if they get that power, will tend to wield it and continue to wield it. And
No, I'm glad I'm glad you actually said that, because it really speaks to the mentality of the individual. And if he can be that way within the relationship of the mother of his child or children, the woman that he's purported to love and is married and who wears his ring, and he's gone for better or for worse till death us do parts. If he can treat somebody who is his home keeper, as so disrespectfully, then how could you trust him dealing with Joe Public on a day-to-day basis? People he doesn't even know.
you can't.
And may I interject?
Absolutely, Nancy.
And I'm glad you brought that up, Jerry. You bring up so much information that is familiar to me, and I'm so glad that you're on board with this. And to be speaking to someone who's seasoned and understands exactly what's going on. Now, what happens often to officers who do try to file a correct and truthful report is incredible. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. And I'd like to speak up for the good officers who are trying to do the right thing as well. Their lives can be, well, Jerry's an example. The officer who ended up filing, like I said, I went through a lot, and there's been 20 years of retaliation too since charges were filed against him. But I looked into the officer who did file charges, and what happened after I was denied a restraining order and the whole bit was this officer came out and he saw the bruises and the red marks on my face appearing, and this was after. And by the way, most of the deaths do occur after the victim separates and ends the relationship, and this was after we separated. And when the officer came out, and it happened to be someone that came out with him when he was harassing me in the past, he saw the bruises and the red marks appearing. I mean, red marks appearing on my face, and he, for some reason, decided to not only file charges against him, but call a judge and get me an emergency restraining order, and that's unheard of. But I looked into this officer's life and his career since, and I found a website where he's pleading. His life is being torn apart. He's being accused of all kinds of things by the department. He was forced into, I think, into retirement, no longer with the department anyway. And you can see this seems to be a pattern of anybody who tries to go against that blue line, and on doing the right thing for any victim of a police officer. I wanted to, may I plug something?
Go ahead, Nancy.
Okay, thank you. There was a Frontline documentary done called "A Death in St. Augustine," and it's on YouTube. And I don't have the, but you can find it on YouTube. It's called "A Death in St. Augustine," and my good friend, she is in this show, so I think it's okay to put her name out there. Her name is Patty O'Connell, and her daughter Michelle O'Connell was shot in the mouth by her police officer boyfriend. And if you watch that, there were several people in law enforcement that were fired over this situation. But as I understand it, and you can watch it to make sure I get it, get the story straight, but the sheriff apparently put pressure on the coroner to rule it a suicide, which seems to be the case in all of these OIDV murder cases, and the coroner did rule it suicide at first, but when Frontline got involved and started investigating, they changed it to murder. But then later they changed it back to suicide, and then they weren't you couldn't contact them. Frontline couldn't get a hold of them, get an interview or even talk to them on the phone. So, and then there were other people involved in this case in law enforcement who tried to speak on behalf of the victim, and they were fired. And you can see, I mean, it doesn't take much of this huge stack of evidence against the officer, who was since promoted and is still working as a police officer, and her death is still ruled suicide. Even the mother had her investigators exhume the body and do extensive investigation and really prove that it was murder. So it's a really good documentary. It's not boring at all, and it can help you see. I think it's amazing because of their art of silencing. I think it's amazing that she was able to do this much and get this much investigation.
Let me just flip over to Jerry again. Sorry, Nance. But Jerry, when complaints of domestic violence are heard or whispered, or there are rumours of an officer that might be getting drunk too regularly after his shift is finished, and maybe his wife has been, because I'm quite sure it must happen where his wife has been seen with the odd black eye here or there, and people have been suspicious. Is it easier to sweep this sort of awareness under the carpet as opposed to challenging it as an officer?
It's easier.
So let me just finish it. Or do they fully aware of what this officer is doing, but just ignore it anyway?
I think it depends on the organization that's involved. It is much easier to sweep it under the rug or ignore it. Oftentimes what will happen is, if they believe that there's domestic violence involved, they will call the officer in and confront the officer, a lot of times with the irrefutable facts that domestic violence occurred. And if the officer says, yeah, I was drunk, or I lost my temper, or it'll never happen again, or it's the first time it ever happened, typically what an administrator will do is will send that person to counseling. Now, officers in and of themselves are anti-counseling most of the time. And so that's, they'll sit and talk to a counselor for, 2 or 3 times, and then that'll be the end of it. The counselor's not going to push too hard.
Okay,
either.
Let me interject very quickly, because I hear where that's going.
Okay.
How often is the spouse, the wife, the abused, included in that process?
In the process of disciplinary action or
investigation, counseling, support, mediation? How much involvement does the spouse get? Because let me put it this way. So I'm a serving officer, no matter what position I'm in, whether I'm a street bobby or I'm a sergeant, right? And there's a rumor, there's a suspicion that I might be drinking a bit too much, or my wife's been seen with a couple of black eyes, and people are saying that I've been beating up on her, and she's been making shouts out. She came down to the station and was shouting on the steps, or she came to the bar where I was with the guys last night and said, look what he's been doing to me, whatever, right? And I suppose, right, so here you have this situation now where people are aware that the wife is shouting about, right? Now, I get called into the office, and I'm the serving officer, and I turn around to my superiors, my captain, my sergeant, whoever, and I say, look, last night was a one-off. She was mad because she found this out. She was mad because I did this. She was mad because I was out with the guys, and we was meant to be doing something else, and and so she does this thing. She's loony. And what she's probably done is she's probably slapped herself in the eye to make it look sore, so she can come up here and make me look bad because I let her down. And so my sergeant says, well, look, Kerv, I hear what you're saying. You kind of need to keep your wife on the wraps. You need to keep her under the thumb. You need to make sure that she doesn't come and do this because it looks bad on you. It looks bad on the office and the badge and everything else. So my question is, in all of that, how much is the wife? Because I could lie to you, as my boss, I could lie to you and tell you that it's all her. It's her playing up on this. It's her behaving badly. It's her escalating it and making this up and exaggerating the situation. It's not really as bad as she's making out. That's just me telling you that because I just need this thing to go away. So how much involvement does the wife get so that she can actually be able to say, well, hang on a minute, Kerv ain't being honest with you here. This has been going on for months. He's been coming home drunk, beating me before he goes to sleep, and half the time he passes out on a settee. How much involvement does the wife get so she can actually tell it like it is?
Very little to none, unless there is the report taken and they document it in the report. If she comes and complains and says, look, I don't want him fired, I just want help, most of the time what you just described, Kervin, occurs, and that is the officer's called in. He said, look, she was just mad. She tripped and fell, or she walked into a door, or whatever it is. And the sergeant or the investigating officer, knowing the ramifications of holding one of their own accountable within that culture, tends to believe the officer and sweeps it under the rug, unless you have a person of strong integrity that's willing to say, no, I know where this could go, and I would feel terrible if he killed her. And let's make it clear, there are female officers that are abusers to their male counterparts as well.
Abuse is abuse, no matter what sex is committed. Abuse is abuse.
I refer to men and women yet always being the victim, but that's not always the case. Although it's much smaller to have a female officer being the abuser.
And I do have the numbers on that. It's 90%. I believe it's I'm looking for it. Something like 90 or 95% male on female as far as abuse, and that's just nationwide, not only within police. But yes, we do have a lot of.
It's normally the case, and even so, most males that are abused by their wives very rarely tell anybody, because it's more embarrassing for a fella to come out and say, you know what, my wife's beating me up when I go home at night. So most fellas don't even report it. We've noticed an increasing trend here in the UK of males now coming out and complaining about being abused by their female partners.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, Nancy.
Oh, okay. I was just going to say, in our OIDV case, it's not a gender issue for us. It's just a power.
For me, abuse is abuse. Whoever's and again, I suppose if you're a police woman carrying a badge and a gun, you have the same opportunity to abuse that authority that as a male has. But here's the question, Nancy: would some form of mediation, involvement, somebody listening to you when you approached about what he was doing, would that have helped at the time, do you think?
Well, I thought it would. That's why I made the call that I made, but I wasn't going to get any ever, and neither do most. And I was glad you brought that up, because this is the series of events that we experience is many times. And in a lot of the dead cases in my research that I've discovered, and then of course looking back on my own experiences again, is the discrediting that goes on. For example, in my case, the first time he threatened me with his gun, he went right away to his colleagues and started telling them that I was abusing him and cheating on him and so on. And I found out, or I believe I discovered, that the reason he did that was because he was afraid I was going to tell on him for threatening me with his gun. So he would set me up for disaster if I ever did that. And all through history, like for example, the famous Crystal Brain. I don't know if Jerry or either of you had heard of the Crystal Brain case, but that her maiden name was Brain. No, her married name was Brain. And her husband's name, it escapes me right now. But anyway, Crystal Brain, her husband, David, had been going to the department, to his colleagues, and saying, she's cheating on me, she's cheating on me. He even dropped a barbell on his arm, and it gave him a dark red bruise. And he had pictures taken of it and put it on file that she did this to him. And she was 105 pounds, and he was probably twice her weight. And of course, there's his tactical training and so forth, and weapon, skills with weapons. But the city attorney blocked an or the city manager blocked an investigation. The press wouldn't help her. Same thing. I myself went through all of this. The press wouldn't help me. The city attorney wouldn't listen. Nobody would listen to me. But in her case, he ended up shooting her in the head in the public. He put a GPS tracker on her car and followed her somewhere, a convenience store. She had the children in the car with her. And he shot her when she got out of the car right in front of the children, and then shot himself. And if somebody had listened, all the times that she had called asking for help, they would probably both still be alive. And this goes on over and over. There's a Tamara Seidel that was killed about 2 years ago by her police officer husband. She had been abused terribly for 25 years, or they were together 25 years, 15 years. Anyway, it's a long time that she was going through this abuse, and he would do just awful things to her and in front of their children. They had 9 children, and she had called the police many times for help. Not a single person did a thing for her. And she filed for divorce. And the day he killed her, he called her children and said, I'm going to kill your mother today. And they called the police, and the police ignored them. And he also had a GPS tracker on her car using police equipment, and chased her through town until she crashed, where there were police officers. And he got out of his car and shot her. And the police officers, they had a standoff for about 30 minutes. And he had his gun in his hand. He held it to his head at times. But for 30 minutes, then he walked around to the front of the car and fired 4 bullets into her. And then they arrested him. But they could have done something. I mean, what do they do? How quickly do they pull that trigger when we have kind of a lot of people, unarmed people, getting killed in our city by police. And this man was armed, and they did nothing until he just finished her off in front of their daughter. And when they arrested him, they didn't throw him to the ground and put cuffs on him and tase him and do all of these things. No, they gave him a hug and put him in the car and told him everything was going to be okay. And then we have in Seal Beach, very close to me here, very recent, about a month ago, a gal by the name of Amanda Jensen was just killed by her police officer. He was a captain of Los Alamitos, and she was a city clerk. And when I found out about it, I was telling people, I wonder how many times she called the police for help. And people were saying, oh, I'm sure this was the first time. But sure enough, the DA spokesperson's story says that they had been out multiple times. There were multiple calls. But in my opinion, they discredited her and, gave excuses for not doing anything to help her, because they say at one point when she called, they said she was drunk. And so they couldn't really be sure if she was telling the truth. She probably wasn't drunk. They said that she gave them pictures of bruises on her face and said that he did it. But then the same day she recanted and said he never touched her. And, even a city clerk isn't safe.
Let me just take you back into yourself a minute, Nancy. How many times did you find yourself on that emotional roller coaster where you were that down, you were that low, you needed a drink or two to just get through the day, dreading what might possibly happen, only to be told that they're very, very sorry, it won't happen again, I love you, and then almost that false sense of security again. Did you experience that yourself, so that you can identify with what was going on with the very said case that you were just referring to?
Well, yes, I was seeing a therapist that he referred me to and was friends with for 10 years before I met him, both. I asked her, he's abusing me and I need to get away. Can you help me? And she shook her head, and I said, well, why are you shaking your head? And she said, you can't leave him. And she told me, you can't take care of yourself. You can't leave him. And I had always been independent before I met him. And he had this control over me to where I was brought to a place where I really believed I couldn't take care of myself. And I really believed I couldn't function without him. And so when she said that, I thought, okay, all right, I guess I'll stay with him. But it was my daughter. It was the birth of my daughter. And my other child, that it was for my children. I decided I was going to get out of there. My children weren't going to suffer this way.
Here's the thing, just a quick one. I want to throw this across to Jerry while we're here. Since advertising this show and promoting it on social media, I've had a series of messages from individuals who wish to remain anonymous. And so although I can't divulge their names and go into great detail, one of the common things that have come across from the messages that I've been receiving is they've been told that they can't leave. If they leave, they're going to be killed. They can't go anywhere because wherever they go, they'll be found, because these officers have access to database that can find them wherever they go. So now you've got people that are entrapped and in fear of their lives, staying in a relationship that they don't want to stay in, for fear of just their life. What could the system, what could the law enforcement office do to give the officers' wives more support and protection, Jerry?
Well, one, they could do their job and deal with the officer that is being accused of, and not everybody that's accused of domestic violence is actually committing domestic violence. There are some spouses that use that officer's position against them, but that's a small number in comparison. If somebody is at a point, if a woman or a spouse of an officer is at the point where they're going to come to the department that officer works for and make an allegation of domestic violence, it damn well better be investigated and looked at, because more often than not, there's going to be credibility to that thing than there isn't. And that isolation, that tendency to discredit is huge. So, and law enforcement knows that. They need to be dealing with that in an above board and in ethical manner. That's the first thing. The second thing is, when there is an allegation of abuse, they need to really watch closely the types of vehicle, if the officer's in patrol, they've got to watch closely what they're running and what kind of check they're using in the national databases, because they just have too much ability to track. If as an officer, he's going to go stay with a friend. Let's use my current situation. I'm not an officer, but if I were, and I were abusing my spouse, if my spouse decided to move to, let's say, Wisconsin, which is where she's from, if I start running names and vehicle registrations out of Wisconsin, there's a red flag. I'm doing something I shouldn't be doing. because if I'm in Idaho or I'm in California, there's not that many names that are going to come out of Wisconsin that your spouse is associated with. So if all of a sudden I'm running those, then that department has to recognize I'm in the process of stalking, and that's another crime in and of itself. So what happens is the domestic violence complaint comes, and then you get the phone harassment, the computer harassment, you get the stalking that occurs either at work or at friends, and each one of those become a crime as we go along, and they're not being prosecuted and they're not being investigated appropriately. So it's an internal thing that has to be dealt with more severely than what it is.
Go on, Nancy.
Thank you. Also, some states have OIDD policies, and I've been in touch with our state senator here in California, and I've sent him copies of sample policies used by other states, a couple of different states, that we would like to have inducted here in California. It'd be nice to do it all over the country, here at least. And then now I realize that the policies, many will just do their own thing and ignore the policies, but you have to start somewhere. And if there are specific OIDV policies for police-involved domestic violence, the next step is to get the departments to follow them. But policies, I believe, could make some difference.
One second, Jerry. Before you answer that, let me just interject a second, because it makes absolute sense to me. In the business fraternity, right, we have what's called shared practice. If it's a good working practice, it's shared practice, and we share that practice with other business users that have a similar objective as we. So when something is good and works in one city, one state, one town, one village, why isn't it cascaded across the rest of the states? Because I understand that each state is governed by its own governors and has its own jurisdiction and has its own rules and its own laws. I get all of that, but why aren't we sharing good working practice?
Can I answer that?
Absolutely.
There is. The International Chiefs of Police have a model policy for officer-involved domestic violence. Unfortunately, there's no evidence that it's being used by the departments that have them. I mean, across the board, we have a standardized policy. And one of the things I believe that should occur, for instance, is if I have an officer and they're accused of domestic violence by their spouse and they're working in my organization, the first thing I'm going to do is go to an outside organization, maybe a state agency, maybe a much larger department, and I'm going to ask them to investigate this officer. And it's going to be an agency that I don't have a lot of contact with. So in my situation, I was a municipal chief of police, and we had the county agency, and then we had the state police. But there were several other agencies within a 2-hour time frame. When I had an officer-involved critical situation, I called the agency from 2 hours away, and I said, I called that agency because they had a high ethical standards in their professional standards and investigative team. And I said, I'd like you to come up and do this investigation. And so what we did is we called officers that had no contact with our department, and we had no contact with our officer, so that I would get the best I could. I've done everything I could to get a fair and impartial investigation that avoids that thin blue line or that blue wall of silence. And that needs to be done across the board. Whenever there's an allegation against one of your officers, rather than the department that officer works for investigating it, an outside agency should be investigating it, especially when it comes to domestic violence.
So absolutely. So in America, you've got what's called internal affairs, right? And
Correct.
they normally deal with when another officer informs another officer who they believe to be corrupt or whatever, and and that's an internal affairs, looking at the affairs of an officer or serving officer, right? So over here in the UK, we have what's called a Police Complaints Commission, and that's an independent body outside of the police force that investigates issues against police. If a police makes a wrongful arrest, or if there's a death in custody, or any of these issues, they're all investigated by the Police Complaints Commission, which is not the police. It's an independent body of individuals who are brought together to investigate what the police have done in this particular scenario. You cannot have the police policing the police and expect to get a fair and just response when they have their personal agenda to protect.
I don't know that I totally agree with that, Kervin. You cannot have the police of the same department policing themselves. I think you can get outside departments, but you have to go outside of the area for a distance in order to do that. And this is a problem that the police are having within themselves. If they're not willing to police themselves, and absolutely it has to be an outside entity. What happens in any critical condition incident, and I would say a officer involved domestic violence is a critical incident for that department. What should happen is the criminal investigation be sent out to an outside agency to do the investigation, while the department itself will do what's called an administrative review. The purpose of the administrative review is to see what kind of civil liability the department is based on that officer's actions. The criminal investigation should be completely separate and outside that agency, because there is if you know your officer was wrong and your department's going to be liable, the last thing you want to do if you're a corrupt organization is have that officer charged and convicted of the very crime because then it benefits the victim for their civil suit. And in those instances, you cannot have the same agency doing the same investigation. So my cry would be that in an incident like this, the criminal investigation be sent outside to another agency. And it could be.
I kind of hear what you're saying there, Jerry, but I disagree. I actually believe that it should be an independent body outside of the police agency altogether, because I still think it leaves room for corrupt and biased response. But let's bring in Nancy here and see how she feels. Would an independent organization, non-affiliated to the police force, would have been more beneficial to you?
I think so. I mean, the thing is that our experience, and this is happening all over the nation, for example, no matter where an OIDV survivor goes, we don't. Many of the survivors go into hiding, and they have to change their names and their social security number if they want to have any kind of possibility of feeling safe in life. But they also, a lot of them give up their families, like a witness protection program, and that's because there's nowhere in the country they can go if their perpetrator contacts another department. That's it. I mean, they believe him anywhere in the country, and so if they find her, she's going back to the same being marked anywhere in the country that she lives. So I hear about the circling the wagon thing, and unfortunately, they don't give up. As I'm not saying they, but the typical stalker type, which I think it's a recipe for disaster when you're a police officer, because many people, not just men, but people can't handle being left, and so how dare you leave me? And they want to stalk the person and make them pay for that. But when you're a police officer, there's no reason to stop, because you've got all this. You're never going to get in trouble for it. Charges aren't going to be filed. So you don't have any reason to really leave the person alone. And people go through it for many, many years. And sometimes to their fatal demise.
Jerry, you said just a short while ago that allowing another organisation within the police force from far outside, possibly, what would benefit. But for me, how would it benefit if the problem is as widespread as we believe it to be, with almost every state and every force experiencing this type of behaviour? What purpose would one state have in outing another state when they've actually got skeletons in their own cupboards?
Well, I still believe that there are a lot of men and women in law enforcement that hold to their ethical oath and their integrity and to integrity. And I think if there were more transparency laws in which the general public can look and maybe I'm naive in this, but look at what is going on, that would clean itself up. I would be in agreement to have an outside agency look for it if some of the people on that outside agency had law enforcement experience. The problem is that there are certain investigative things and certain ways an investigation is conducted that it's nice to have somebody within law enforcement say that investigation was done completely incorrectly, or that one was done correctly and they should have done something about it. And so bring in, if you're going to have an outside agency, bring in retired investigators, or do not hand the whole thing, but at least have somebody that has past law enforcement experience to have a voice on that committee. It doesn't have to have a majority, but have a voice. They can at least help illuminate and edify why something were done.
I'm losing you a minute, Jerry. You're breaking up a bit. I need to get a stronger signal for me.
I'm sorry.
Did you want to come in,
Go ahead,
Nancy?
Yes, may I? Thank you. So, yes, I'd like to say I do agree with that. And I want to be sure I don't sound too biased. I have a survivor. We call each other survivor sisters. And I have a survivor sister. She goes by the name of Jane Doe, but she wrote a book called The Blue Abyss. It's really amazing. She wrote it herself, so there are typos, but it's really her story. In her story, she explains there are two officers who helped her get safety. She wouldn't be alive right now if it wasn't for them. So, yes, it's very important to understand that there are wonderful, wonderful people in law enforcement who are very ethical and do their best to do the right thing. For them, it can be very difficult. Oftentimes, though, it does lead to an early retirement for them, or even worse. Which I'm not going to go into right now, the worst, but they go through some of them who are trying to stand up against this stuff. But the problem is there's no difficulty in finding those that are unethical, and those are the ones that make life impossible for survivors.
Right. So, if domestic violence is repulsive, any form of domestic violence is repulsive to most common sense individuals, how is it being made to seem almost acceptable? And let me make the point that I'm trying to get to, because I would imagine, and going back to what I was trying to say earlier on, in reference to having different states policing other states based on the fact that they've got skeletons in their own cupboards. I'm quite sure that part of the mentality that they have is the justification that is such a high stressed job with such difficult circumstances to be dealing with on a day-to-day basis. It's almost acceptable that an individual should have some way of letting off that steam somewhere, and if the wife at home is the one that gets it, then it's better than it's happening out on the street. Am I making any sense here, Jerry?
You make sense. Let me back up and say I don't believe that. There are some in law enforcement that believe exactly that. And if the wife was beaten by her law enforcement husband, she deserved it. That is repulsive, and that is as degrading as one could get. There are also a lot of good people out there that would be the first ones that would hold the officer accountable and to clean up law enforcement if they had a mechanism in which to do so. And that's the problem internally with the law enforcement situation. There is no mechanism for the good officers to step forward and do the right thing because they can't disclose that they're doing the right thing. There are laws that prevent them from doing that. So it's much easier to hide that. And from an administrator standpoint, administrators have, and we talked about this last time, have that pressure of, well, if I fire this person, am I going to be able to replace them? And that's the wrong way of looking at it, because you don't want somebody that's abusing their spouse and using power and control on your force, because now you have a badge heavy cop, and he's going to do it across the board with not only his spouse but people out on the street. It's a bastard.
Oh, and I would like to. I wanted to ask Jerry, how can I find those policies that you mentioned? What did you call them?
The International Chiefs of Police Association.
There are policies because I have tried to find policies, at least for here in California, and I didn't know. Everyone I reached out to knows nothing until now about any OIDV policies in nationwide, for sure. I thought there was a policy. There were OIDV policies with the Department of Justice, but now I'm not able to find them. I even spoke to the city attorney here, and guess what? The city attorney didn't know what OIDV meant.
Well, there are standard policies that the International Chiefs of Police came out with. The other thing you can look for is CALEA, which is it started in California. CALEA did, but it's the Certified Law Enforcement Agency. They also have standardized policies that departments that are accredited, and departments in California are accredited, have to maintain certain policies, and OIDV is one of those. So the question is not that the policies exist, it's whether they're being enforced.
Right, and I understand that, but I realize that we have to start somewhere. And as far as like awareness, trying to spread awareness, I've been asked, why do I do this? Police officers are thought of as heroes. Why are you even, it's not going to do you any good. Well, if the public understands what they go through, these survivors don't have anyone to turn to. Even their own family members turn against them because they're afraid of getting disappointing law enforcement. So when they turn to somebody, they're often called crazy. Their stories are so ridiculous. Nobody can believe that anyone would do those things to them, especially a law enforcement officer of all people. And the whole department refusing to help them, you must be lying, lady. So if the public is aware, when somebody comes to them and says, I'm an OIDV survivor, can you help me? It'd be nice if people thought, oh my gosh, you're in trouble. Let's see what we can do to help you. So that's, one of the many reasons awareness is important. If we can't make them, get anybody to follow the policies, at least have them there. And I just kind of believe that some will.
Here's another point for you both to consider and respond to, and I'll put it to you, Nancy, first. So, because when we first spoke, when I first shared the idea of when we first shared this idea of doing this show, and I first posted the advert, one of the things that I said on it, which you disagreed with at the time, and we promised that we would go over. So I'm opening the door to that now. Was I said that some of them were even forced to take their own life, And you mentioned to me, no, they didn't. There's not a lot of them that was forced to take their own life. It was suicide, or it was called suicide. But some of them were even killed or shot or by their husbands, the law officer. So I suppose what I'm trying to raise before we go into that, and I do think we need to go into that a bit so that we can open that up a bit. Even when the officer or when the wife has now been found dead, irrespective of what the belief is, whether it was suicide or whether it was murder, surely once the wife is found dead, should that not initiate another investigation as to, well, hang on a minute, was there any truth to what she was saying? Because why would somebody just go and end their life like that? Surely you would want to know, and that should trigger another investigation at least. Would you not agree? Firstly, Nancy, and then Jerry, could you come in on that, please?
Yes, absolutely. I do. But in many of the cases, there are young children involved, and also most of them are shot in the head. And when we've established, right, that there are 900,000 police officers in America, and when it's 2 to 4 times national rate, so that's more than 40% of officers committing domestic violence, and then you have only 49% of the victims living through their escape plans. That's a lot of deaths. And why, when women don't typically, for suicide, they don't shoot themselves, especially in the head. So why are all these police wives killing themselves by shooting themselves in the head? And there are women typically will survive for their children, and not just go and kill themselves because they're in a bad relationship. It really doesn't add up. And also, notoriously, a lot of these cases, and mine, there was put on file that I was suicidal as well, and they rely on this file that the perpetrator places, the police officer whose wife ends up dead, shot in the head, that she was suicidal. To me, that says that right there should be a sign that this was a pre-planned, attempt to kill, a plan to kill her, and now she's dead, and she is not the one that said to anyone that she was suicidal, only him. And so the case after case, these police wives have the officer husband or boyfriend placed on file that she was suicidal before she was killed.
Bearing in mind, Jerry, that the national rate is almost 4 times the national average, surely once the wife has been found dead in any circumstances, it should raise a red flag.
Absolutely. Any time, especially in a violent death, but any time any unattended death should be treated as a homicide to start with. And then once the evidence rules out it isn't a homicide, then you can go that way. And it's not. What happens is the officer's department will come and go, this is tragic, we'll support the officer. And they don't do the area investigation to determine whether or not it's a homicide. Let me give you an example that I lived with. There was an officer that came out of California and actually became the chief of police in a small town in Idaho. He then was convicted in Idaho because he was embezzling and did some grant that he shouldn't have done, was convicted, and he moved back to California. And in California, he wound up killing his wife. He wound up drowning her in a hot tub, and a neighbor happened to see it. There had always been rumors that it was a domestic violence situation, but nobody could ever get any information to that effect. And the neighbor happened to watch him drown his wife. It was a Chris Hall case in Riverside. The first trial ended up in a mistrial. In the second trial, he was convicted of murder. So there are times when departments do the right thing. It's just not enough. They don't do it enough of the time.
Let me go on, Nancy.
Oh, thank you. There was that the thing that I heard you mention before, Jerry, which is there's no expectation of accountability. That's part of the problem. They see that so many other people get away with it, and they watch over and over. Remember these statistics. They know their buddies get away with it. They're going to get away with it.
Unfortunately, you're correct. And until we open up the transparency laws to where organizations have to disclose disciplinary actions or investigations of their officers, we're going to have that. We're going to continue to have them hiding these kinds of things.
Right.
I think if those laws opened up, a study done by a professor for law enforcement in Florida, and it was dealing with sexual harassment of female officers. And it got to the point where if an officer alleged a sexual harassment, then they weren't getting the backup they needed, and there was no follow-up from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement to do an investigation unless that officer not only went to their department and complained about it, but then went to the the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and complained under an EEOC violation. Would they do anything? And that's horrendous. That should never happen.
Right.
For me, once the victim or the alleged victim, as their life has come to an end in an unsavory manner, questionable, it should open the door to a whole new investigation, which should reintroduce all of the complaints that had been previously made, ignored and swept under the carpet for whatever reason, and the officer should be suspended immediately, irrespective of whatever position they hold, until some sort of clarification could be made on that particular situation. Because without that clarification, you've got a loose cannon on your force. So I think there are many places in work where the level of integrity appears to be much higher than in something that holds such an official office as law enforcement. And what I mean is, you can work in many areas in your community where if you fail in one area or another, you're likely to be sent home or suspended because let me clarify. I worked as a support worker for the Salvation Army for about 4 or 5 years, and we worked with vulnerable homeless individuals who were drug addicted or alcohol dependent. And because we were a charity, we were part of our remit, and part of the contract that we signed was that we were ambassadors for the company, and anything that we did outside of our working hours, would have an impact on the company and the work that we did within it. So we had to be mindful. We couldn't go out and just get drunk and get ourselves into a fight on a Saturday night, because it's the kind of thing that guys do when they go out on a Saturday night, bearing in mind that if it got back to the workplace on a Monday morning, we could be out of a job. And that's not law enforcement. That's just a support worker working with a dropout drug addict or an alcoholic. So how much more significance should be placed upon the integrity of somebody who is there to serve and protect?
There should be a high level. In fact, there are policies that prevent officers. Anything that the policy, and it's in the law enforcement code of ethics, that you are not to do anything that'll bring discredit to the profession, yourself, or your organization.
So
but being it's not being enforced at the level it should be. See, law enforcement's had the ability under self-policing to really take care of themselves, and for the last 30 to 40 years, they've done a miserable job in self-policing. And what's happening now is we've got enough of the information getting out to the public that they're losing the ability to self-police, and they should. They've lost that right. They didn't maintain it, but they've still got that secrecy and that wall that they can call upon because the laws have allowed them to do that, and that those need to be changed.
Let me
Right.
just before you come in, Nancy, just another quick one. I was a qualified chauffeur many years ago, and the guy that I used to drive for was a private merchant banker. And every year the auditors used to come and audit them. And this auditor wasn't from his bank. It wasn't from a friend's bank. It was a totally independent person. And I could remember because my gaffer, my boss, Colin, used to say to me, he used to send me down to Duke Street, which is because I worked in Piccadilly, right near the Ritz Hotel. And it was a very expensive off-license, you call it the liquor store where you are. We call it an off-license over here. And there was a bottle of whiskey which was called As We Get It, which was very strong, and it came from Scotland, and it was £25 a bottle, and that's what Collingwood sent me down to Duke St James Street to go and buy a bottle of this thing while his auditor was doing, and it wasn't to bribe the auditor. They just knew that the auditor liked that bottle of whiskey. It wasn't to make the auditor fabricate his audit. It was a courteous thing that was done, and he never expected the auditor to bend or twist anything in his favour. At Salvation Army, as a support unit, we were audited by two separate outside bodies plus our own. So yes, we had our own head office that would come down and audit our files, our support files, our case notes to make sure that we were supporting these people correctly. But we also had two separate outside agencies that would audit us and would take away our certificate if we weren't up to standard. So what I'm talking about here now is, you've already mentioned it and you've confirmed it. Policing the police, or the police policing themselves, auditing themselves, investigating themselves, just doesn't work. And until we can get an outside body, totally alien to the police force, who can come inside and deal with all of these queries, questions, and investigations, especially where moral and integrity is concerned, we're never going to get justice for those that are subjected to any forms of crime that has been perpetrated against them by the law enforcement officers.
Most likely not. I agree with you.
So how do we move towards getting an independent audit, an independent review, an independent investigation, an independent complaints authority, an independent body that's responsible, that has the authority to suspend or reject a license? Because you see, if you could go into a particular state and say that this particular office has got 6 unlawful killings to its name this month, has got 4 officers up on reprimand for various types of corruption or whatever, they don't actually deserve to have a certificate to run law enforcement in this city. I mean, that's the kind of reform that I'd like to see.
It's nice in theory. The problem is certain agencies, when you're in municipality, you must, and you get to a certain size, and I don't remember what it is, it's relatively small, you must have a law enforcement agency. That's the law.
I'm not saying that you don't have it. I'm just saying that the one that's existing can't be trusted to run. You license it out to another state.
Well, one of the problems that we have is officers on or off duty, and no matter what they do, it seems they're protected by the most aggressive legal team in the world, which
Absolutely.
is the police officer. So that's a problem. The police officers' Bill of Rights is a problem because they are, they're very, very powerful, and they're, there's no cost is too high to protect them and defend them. So
I was getting at, you're right, Nancy, but what I was getting at, Kervin, is there is no certificate for police department to be removed. There are individual certification of the individual office, but the municipality must have or make arrangements for some sort of police protection. So you can't just automatically go in and say this one's not performing well. You have to you remove the certificate for that city. You have to remove the administration and bring in an administration that will do the right things, and that's going to require transparency, opening up the transparency laws so the community members see what's going on, and they are the ones that can bring about the political change with the elected officials, or they remove the elected officials.
The thing is, we can come up with as many different types of ideas or suggestions that we like while we sit down here and deliberate on radio. But it's the community that's suffering. It's the community that suffers. You look at all of the issues that we look at, especially on this particular show with the forms of police brutality, unlawful killings, and now this particular subject. And my heart, cries. And I'm sure God's heart cries for the communities that are subjected to such substandard expectations of something that used to be held so high. If you look at how long it took for people to see what was going on with Catholicism and the priests, not just in the UK but worldwide, abusing children and all of that stuff that was going on. Because that was another infrastructure that had the highest regard, the highest level of respect, and people expected them to perform or be at a certain level. So when people making complaints, there was very few people. They were governed by themselves. Nobody was interfering with the Vatican because the Vatican controlled Catholicism. But once outside agencies started to get a foot in and were able to start challenging and questioning what was going on here, we were able to start seeing results. So I again reiterate and insist that unless we start seeing outside bodies being allowed to come in and investigate into individual states or individual issues that are taking place from state to state, countrywide, we're not going to see law enforcement operating at the level that it should be operating at. Now, we don't want to have any silence. So, Nancy, are you there?
Too much or let that get me too upset because, you can tell people that you're, the way it really is.
Let me see if Kervin's back on. Are you back on, Kervin?
Yeah, I'm back on now. I'm back. I disappeared. I'm not sure. I lost connection.
Yeah, no, I saw that. Go ahead, Nancy. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, thank you. That's fine. Are we on the air now? Or
no, we were always on the air. We were always on the air. It's just that I lost connection.
Oh, okay. We were still on the air. Okay.
Go ahead and finish your thought.
Pardon me?
Go ahead and finish your thought.
I think. Let's see. Where was I? I was saying that there were officers. I don't remember where I was, but I kind of made my point anyway. I think as far as that goes. But there was something I just wanted to go backwards on just a little bit when we were talking about Kervin had mentioned I had said I didn't really like saying that the women, some women have, I don't even like saying it now, been suicidal. When I expressed my reasons why it doesn't make sense, all these people are ruled, all these deaths are ruled suicide. There's also in the many cases that I looked into, they're not easy to find. But the ones I know about, there's been a history of phone calls to the police departments, to the jurisdictional police departments, by these women, and some men who have ended up dead. So that doesn't sound like somebody that would kill themselves. Somebody that's asking for help was my point there. I just wanted to get that last bit in about that. Also, if I may, I don't. You may have been on a subject already. Were you? And if you were, I'd like to allow you.
No, that's fine. But let's just carry on with where we are.
Okay. I wanted to be sure I got to back to this point way earlier in the conversation about the day that my ex called the police on me when he wanted to force me into an abortion. What happened was they told me that they couldn't take me to a shelter, but what they couldn't, I didn't want to stay there because I felt like my life, or especially my daughter's life, was in danger. So they said that they could take me to a hospital and I could talk to someone there. Well, me not understanding what exactly that meant, all I wanted to do was get away, so I said yes. So they frisked me and handcuffed me and put me in the back of the car and took me to a hospital around the corner. And when I was there, I was released right away, so I was disappointed because I had nowhere to, no safe place to stay. But the evaluator who I spoke with told me, well, we can't keep you here because there's nothing wrong with you except you're being abused by an alcoholic. I didn't know what that meant until many years later when my life was falling apart and I told somebody about this incident and they told me to obtain those records. So I went and got those records and discovered in requesting anything and everything that was filed involving that case. When I obtained the records, I found out that the officer who took me to the hospital told them that I wanted to shoot myself in the head with a gun. And they were trying to have me 5150'd. You know what that means, right?
Yep, I do. It's an imminent situation.
Right, and Kervin. You know what that means, Kervin?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. I didn't know if it was different in the UK. So they were trying to have me 5150'd. Luckily for me, the doctor had crossed out suicidal ideation and wrote error and explained that I was there because he tried to force me into an abortion, something like that. But there were also further documents filed later, 2 years later. And of course also they didn't hold me. So I was never 5150 because they didn't hold me long enough for that. I was released as soon as we spoke. So so there's no 5150 on a file for me. But 2 years later, when I had no police involvement whatsoever and there were no open cases or anything, police involvement in my life, an Anaheim homicide detective went to the hospital and forged documents to get those records. And I thought, well, why are they doing that? Why would a homicide detective, out of the blue, with no probable cause, go to the hospital and obtain these records that say, I want to shoot myself in the head with a gun? Quote unquote. Those are the words that the officer used. So I have those documents. And I'll leave it up to you why someone would do something like that. To just kind of try and figure that out, because I have my own ideas. And it sounds to me, this is kind of the kind of thing that we go through, though, is my point.
You see, here's the thing. In America, you call it 5150. Here in the UK, it's called sectioned. And it's a state of mental health. And the police do not have the authority to section you. If the police believe that you are likely to either harm yourself or another, or they believe that you're in a serious state of mental health, we have the Mental Health Act, which protects you. So therefore, they have to call in the Mental Health Act team, who will then come in and assess you. And only upon their assessment can you be sectioned. Now, for example, your partner, your spouse, your mother, your father, they can ask to have you sectioned. They can turn around and say, you're behaving in a very unfashionable manner, you're violent, you've threatened them with a knife, or you've said that you're going to kill yourself or kill a child. They can say all of these things, but that still won't get you sectioned in this country. You still have to be seen by a mental health clinician, physician, doctor, who is well trained and versed in that area, and only upon his say-so or her say-so will you be sectioned and medicated. So
right,
again, let me reiterate, that's why having outside bodies involved in the whole operation gives it a lot more transparency.
Well, that is kind of the way it was done there. I mean, the police officers brought me in, but it wasn't up to him to decide whether I was unstable or not. It was up to the doctor, and the doctor decided that I was not. I had no idea that they were saying that about me, because I was just safety. But you could probably imagine, I mean, 2 years later, I had no involvement with my ex. I wasn't communicating with him in any way. And yet, I find out, I mean, I read this paperwork, and it says that I want to shoot myself in the head with a gun, which nobody would say that. I don't think anybody would say that. They might say, I want to shoot myself. But I mean, that was a really difficult time for me, and that was 18 years after we separated that I discovered this paperwork. And I started putting together, I had been putting together, and that was why I obtained the paperwork, what was happening to me and why. And because there were no names or faces behind my problems, these terrible experiences I was having. But to find that, it kind of summed things up for sure. But then in my research, and Michelle O'Connell, who I explained to you at Death in St. Augustine, her boyfriend put on file that she was suicidal before he killed her. So, and this was something I was aware of. I was aware of her situation, but discovered that he put this information on file after my discovery of my own case. But you could imagine how traumatizing and how scary it is to see this. But some, many, not some, but many people don't live after this has been going on.
Here's the thing: domestic violence is a very traumatic experience for anybody to have to go through and live, and we've witnessed that over the years, as some have not been able to live through it, either being killed or taking their own life in various aspects. How much greater is the trauma or the experience when the one that is subjecting you to that abuse is those that should be protecting you from that type of abuse.
Right.
It's beyond imagining. We're coming to the end of the show now, and I'm quite sure there's so much more that we can go into that we haven't gone into. But I'm also sure that there's information that you also, Nancy, want to get out there, websites that people can visit, information or places that they can go to. But before you do that, let me just go to Jerry, because first and foremost, I do really want to thank you, Jerry, for coming on board and sharing that time with us today. and being able to contribute and input such a wealth of knowledge in a subject that I am absolutely out of my water in. But I just want to thank you. What would you say to those that were listening if they were involved in a relationship with a law enforcement officer who felt themselves swimming against the tide?
They would need to, if they're going to get out of that situation, they need to do so covertly, and they need to just disappear the best they can, and go to a community, let them know what's going on, and maybe that community law enforcement would help in protecting them. That's about the best they can do. I don't have any great insight for them at all. Nancy probably has better information on that than I do at this point.
Well, Jerry, I just want to thank you for coming on board and supporting us. I've got to tell you before you go away, I've got a host of other shows that I'll be inviting you to. You will be a regular guest as often as you are available for particular shows, because I do love spending time and talking with you. You're so informative, so knowledgeable in the field, and it's an honor to have you on the show. And
I'm honored to be there. Thank you so much.
Likewise.
Thank you very much, Jerry. I'm gonna close with Nancy. Is there any websites, any information that you want to hand out now quickly before we finish?
Yes, and also I'd like to definitely get it on record right now that I've never been suicidal. And I doubt that I ever will be. So I want to make sure that I said that. Also, yes, there's my Facebook page, When They Go Home, OIDV Awareness. And for survivors that are living in fear, please message me through that Facebook page. And also, we do have a secret group where it's only for survivors of OIDV. And we have, I have connections with other survivors and things like that, so we can at least, I have helped people get to safety, and I don't know where they are myself right now. There have been also people I never heard from again, which concerns me. But you can definitely, I can put you in touch with other people who understand what you're going through, if nothing else, so you can realize you're not alone. Also, there are steps that you can take that we can help you as far as documenting and keeping your documentation safe, and finding safety. But like Jerry said, oftentimes you need to disappear.
You know, I just want to thank you both for coming on and talking about a very sensitive subject, one that's very close to my heart at the moment, which I won't go into just yet. But yeah, I fully, totally understand. And my heart goes into. I pray that God be with you, and those that are subjected to what you've had to go through, and that the family are kept safe. And once again, just want to thank you and Jerry for the time that we've had and sharing this great and sensitive story. And I pray that those that are listening will get some comfort from what we've just had to share today. Thank you guys very much. No, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
We're out of here. Ooh, what a story, what a story, what a day. Nancy West and Jerry Summers.
Did my time. I paid for my crime.
I tell you what, a great show. The show will be available on YouTube probably in about an hour's time or so, as soon as it's downloaded. Look out for it. Sometimes there are things that we go through on the show that leaves us speechless. That's one of them.
Already did my time.
Please do remember that there will be no issues today for the next 2 weeks. I'm away on annual leave. But you can catch me tomorrow morning for my last gospel show before I go away on holiday.
System, it was all about survival. It was do or die. I had to.
Once again, I just want to thank Jerry Summers and Nancy West
I learned my lessons
for sharing their great experiences, wealth of knowledge on Married to the Badge, Issues Today on World Jam Global Radio. We're out of here.
Life is so sweet. Now things have changed. The whole game has been rearranged. I'm a changed man. Don't need no gun in my hand. It ain't about being no gangster. Life is too short to spend it all in jail. Trying to cope with this living hell. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. I was a drug dealer, sold more drugs than Superfly, but I never got high on my own supply. I'm not proud of what I had to do. That's why I'm telling my story to you and you. I had to repent. I must admit, I was doing all kind of stupid shit. Now sit back and think it over since I've gotten older. The life I used to live, I wouldn't do it again. I was young and dumb, my brain was so numb. I was a real Forrest Gump, but I was nobody's chump. Me and Billy the Kid had a lot in common. I was the real Terminator, much meaner than Arnold Schwarzenegger. I'd shoot you up and spit you up.